Most Africans will retire poor, not might, not could, will. This is not a prediction, based on pessimism or a lack of faith in African potential. It is a mathematical conclusion drawn from the specific financial behaviors, the specific savings rates, the specific pension system realities, and the specific economic conditions that characterize the working lives of the majority of people across Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and most of anglophone Africa. The numbers are not ambiguous. Less than 5% of Nigeria's working population is covered by any formal pension scheme. In Ghana, the figure is slightly higher but still represents a minority of the working population. Across sub-Saharan Africa, the overwhelming majority of people who will stop working in the next 20 to 30 years have no formal retirement savings vehicle, no pension entitlement, and no investment portfolio, generating income independent of their continued active work. What they have, in most cases, is the expectation that their children will support them, and their children, who are themselves caught in the same cycle of active income dependency, inadequate savings rates, and unprotected wealth that this entire series has been addressing, will face the dual burden of supporting their own financial progress while simultaneously supporting parents who have nothing else. This is not a criticism of African family values. The expectation of family support for elderly parents reflects a genuine and beautiful cultural commitment to intergenerational solidarity, but it is a financial reality that places an enormous and often unsustainable burden on the next generation, a burden that could be substantially reduced or eliminated if the current generation builds adequate retirement assets during their working years. Dangote, at whatever point in his life he decides to stop actively working, will not face this situation, not because he is a billionaire, though he is, but because the specific financial behaviors he has maintained across 4 decades of working life have built productive assets that will generate income indefinitely, regardless of whether he continues working or not. The question this video answers is not whether you will retire. You will eventually, either by choice or by the physical reality of aging. The question is whether you will retire with resources adequate to maintain your dignity and meet your needs, or whether you will retire dependent on whatever your children, your community, or your government happens to be able and willing to provide at that moment. Today, I am going to give you the exact plan that determines which of those 2 outcomes your own retirement represents. Act 1. Why the traditional retirement plan in Africa is broken before the specific plan. I need to address something directly, because the most common response I encounter when discussing retirement planning in African contexts is a version of the same objection. My retirement plan is my children. I understand this response. I understand the cultural logic behind it. I understand that for previous generations, this plan worked. Families were larger, children were more numerous, and the economic conditions that made supporting elderly parents feasible were more widely available. But here is the specific reality of why this plan is increasingly unreliable as a primary retirement strategy in the current African economic environment. The dependency ratio is shifting. The families that could comfortably support elderly parents in previous generations had 5, 6, 7 children distributing the financial responsibility across multiple earners. Today's families are smaller, 2, 3, perhaps 4 children, concentrating that same financial responsibility on fewer earners, each of whom is simultaneously managing their own financial obligations in an increasingly expensive economic environment. The geographic reality is changing. Adult children increasingly live in different cities, different countries, different economic contexts from their aging parents. The practical and logistical reality of providing consistent financial support across these distances is substantially more complicated than within the extended family compounds of previous generations. The economic pressure is intensifying. The combination of inflation, currency instability, housing costs, educational costs, and the general economic pressures of urban African life in the current period means that adult children who genuinely want to support their parents are increasingly constrained in their capacity to do so, not because of unwillingness, but because their own financial margins are narrower than those of previous generations in real terms. None of this means that family support disappears. It means that relying on it as your primary retirement strategy, rather than as a supplement to your own built retirement assets, is a financial risk whose probability of inadequate outcome is increasing. rather than decreasing with each passing decade. The specific plan I am about to walk through does not ask you to abandon family, values, or reject the genuine support that family provides. It asks you to build enough of your own retirement asset base that family support becomes a welcome additional blessing rather than an existential financial necessity. The disruptor here is a calculation that I want you to do right now. Think of the oldest person in your immediate family, a parent, an uncle or aunt, a grandparent if they are still living, someone who worked for most of their adult life. Now ask yourself, honestly, if that person's children, including you, were unable to provide any financial support starting tomorrow, would that person have sufficient independent resources to meet their basic needs? For the vast majority of people across anglophone Africa, the answer to that question is no. Now ask yourself the second question. In 30 years, when you are that person's age, will your answer be different? If you do not have a specific, documented plan that makes your answer different, if your retirement plan consists primarily of vague intention, the expectation of family support, or a pension scheme whose adequacy you have never actually calculated, then you are currently on track to reproduce exactly the same situation in the next generation. The plan I am about to give you is what changes that answer. Act 2. The retirement math most people never calculate before building the plan. You need to understand the specific numbers involved, because most people who think about retirement think about it in vague terms rather than specific calculations, and vague thinking produces vague plans that fail to produce adequate outcomes. Here is the retirement calculation framework that every person reading this should complete for their own specific situation. Step 1. Calculate your retirement income need. The standard financial planning assumption is that retirement requires approximately 70 to 80% of pre-retirement income to maintain the same standard of living, because certain working life expenses, like commuting costs and work-related clothing, disappear, while other expenses, like healthcare, tend to increase. In African contexts, the specific percentage may vary based on individual circumstances, and particularly whether significant housing costs will continue into retirement or will have been eliminated through property ownership, and whether family support obligations will continue or will have been reduced as children reach financial independence. For the purpose of this calculation, use 70% of your current monthly income as a starting estimate of your monthly retirement income need. Step 2. Calculate how long your retirement will last. Average life expectancy across most African countries has been increasing across recent decades, and this trend is expected to continue. Current life expectancy figures suggest that someone retiring at 60 in Nigeria, Ghana, or Kenya can reasonably expect to live for another 15 to 25 years, depending on individual health factors and access to healthcare. Planning for 20 years of retirement from age 60 to age 80 represents a reasonable baseline that avoids both dramatically overestimating and dramatically underestimating the required provision. Step 3. Calculate the total retirement asset required. Multiplying your monthly retirement income need by 240 months, which represents 20 years of monthly payments, gives you a rough estimate of the total retirement asset required, assuming no investment return on the retirement fund during the distribution phase, with a more realistic assumption that retirement assets will continue generating some return during the distribution phase, say a modest 10% annual return on remaining assets. The required total retirement asset is somewhat lower, approximately 120 times your monthly retirement income need. For someone with a current monthly income of 300,000 naira, targeting 70% replacement, the calculation looks like this. Monthly retirement income need, 210,000 naira. Total retirement asset required, approximately 25,000 naira. Using the 120 times multiplier, this number feels large. It is large, but divided across the working years remaining before retirement, it becomes a specific monthly savings and investment target rather than an overwhelming, abstract goal. For someone with 30 working years remaining, reaching 200,000 naira requires building approximately 40,000 naira per year in retirement assets, or approximately 70,000 naira per month. This includes both direct contributions and the investment returns generated on those contributions as they accumulate, which means the actual monthly contribution required is substantially less. than 70,000 naira if invested in instruments generating meaningful returns across the accumulation period. Step 4. Calculate your current retirement asset gap. Take the total retirement asset required from Step 3 and subtract whatever you currently have in retirement-designated savings or investments. The result is your retirement asset gap, the specific amount your plan needs to build between now and retirement. This gap, divided by the number of months remaining until your target retirement age, gives you a monthly retirement savings target, a specific number that makes the vague intention to save for retirement into a concrete, trackable monthly action. Most people who have never done this calculation are now either motivated or paralyzed. Motivated if the numbers feel achievable, paralyzed if they feel overwhelming. If you are paralyzed, here is the specific reframe that matters. Every month you delay starting this calculation and building toward the required number, the monthly contribution required increases because the same total needs to be accumulated across fewer remaining months with less time for compounding to do its work. The most expensive month in your entire retirement plan is the current one. If you do not start this month, the second most expensive is next month. If you start this month instead of next month, compounding works in both directions. It builds wealth when you start early and invest consistently. It builds the required monthly contribution when you delay, because the same destination requires more effort per remaining month the later you begin. Start the calculation today, not next month, today. Act 3. The 6-pillar retirement plan here is the specific plan, not a general framework, a 6-pillar structure that addresses every dimension of retirement security, available to someone building their retirement assets in African markets today. Pillar 1. The Pension Foundation. If you are employed in the formal sector in Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, or most other anglophone African countries, some form of mandatory pension contribution is likely already operating. The Nigerian Contributory Pension Scheme, Ghana's National Pension Scheme, Kenya's NSSF, or equivalent structures in other markets. The first action in building your retirement plan is understanding exactly what you currently have in these schemes, the specific balance, the specific contribution rate, and a realistic projection of what that scheme will provide at your target retirement age. For most people, this calculation produces a sobering result. The mandatory contribution rates in most African pension schemes and the returns generated on those contributions are insufficient to fund a comfortable retirement on their own. They provide a foundation, a guaranteed minimum that reduces the total burden on other retirement pillars, but they are rarely sufficient as a standalone retirement vehicle. Knowing the specific gap between what your pension scheme will provide and what your retirement income needs require is the essential first step toward building the additional pillars needed to close that gap. Pillar 2, the equity accumulation portfolio. This is the pillar that most people with the longest runway to retirement should weight most heavily, specifically because the combination of dividend income and capital appreciation available from equity positions in productive enterprises, compounded across a long accumulation period, has historically produced returns that substantially outpace inflation and provide the most powerful long-term wealth building available in most market environments. The specific instruments available vary by market. Listed equities on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, the Ghana Stock Exchange, the Nairobi Securities Exchange, and other African capital markets represent the primary vehicle. Index funds and mutual funds, where available, provide diversification across multiple equity positions without requiring the individual stock selection expertise that direct equity investment demands. The specific contribution approach for this pillar is the same pre-allocation discipline discussed in earlier content in this series, a fixed percentage of monthly income directed automatically into equity positions, regardless of market conditions in any specific month, maintained consistently across the entire accumulation period. This approach, called dollar cost averaging in financial planning terminology, removes the temptation to time the market to try to buy when prices are low and stop buying when prices are high. Market timing consistently underperforms consistent, regular investment across virtually every documented research study on the topic, because the price movements that make timing seem sensible in retrospect are almost impossible to predict reliably in advance. Pillar 3. The real estate income asset. Physical property that generates rental income represents one of the most reliable retirement income pillars available in African markets, specifically because the income it generates adjusts over time to reflect the inflationary environment, providing natural inflation protection that pure fixed income instruments do not. The specific retirement planning application of real estate differs somewhat from the passive income application discussed in earlier content. For retirement specifically, the goal is to own income-generating property outright, without mortgage obligations by the time retirement begins, so that the rental income represents net income available for living expenses rather than partially offset by debt service. This means that the retirement real estate strategy typically involves acquiring properties during the accumulation phase with a mortgage or other financing, and systematically paying down that financing across the working years, so that by retirement the property is owned free and clear. The rental income from a free and clear property in a well-located urban African market represents a reliable, inflation-adjusting retirement income stream that requires minimal ongoing management and provides an asset whose value is not purely currency-denominated, making it one of the most robust retirement income sources available. Pillar 4. The business system asset. This pillar is specific to entrepreneurially oriented individuals and in African markets, where formal employment is less universally available than in more developed economies. It represents a retirement pillar that a substantial proportion of the population can and should build. Business system, as distinct from a business that requires the owner's active personal involvement to function, generates income independently of whether the owner is working. It has documented processes, capable people who can execute those processes without the owner's moment-to-moment supervision, and a customer base that is loyal to the business, rather than exclusively to the individual owner. Building this kind of system during the working years and transitioning from active involvement to ownership, oversight during the years approaching retirement, creates a retirement income stream that draws on business profits without requiring continued full-time work, and creates an asset whose value can be realized through sale if circumstances warrant. The specific work of building a business system, rather than a business dependent on your personal involvement, was discussed in detail in earlier content on this channel. In the retirement planning context, the key additional principle is timing, ensuring that the transition from active management to ownership oversight happens gradually and intentionally, with capable successors or management teams in place before retirement, rather than scrambled together in response to a health crisis or unexpected circumstance. Pillar 5. The foreign currency protection layer. This pillar addresses the specific risk that currency devaluation or persistent inflation in your home market erodes the real value of retirement assets accumulated in local currency, a risk that is particularly relevant in markets like Nigeria and Ghana that have experienced significant currency depreciation across recent periods. The specific implementation involves maintaining a meaningful proportion of retirement savings in assets denominated in more stable foreign currencies. US dollars being the most widely available and most commonly used in African contexts, though other stable currencies are available depending on individual circumstances and regulatory environment. This foreign currency layer serves two specific functions in a retirement portfolio. It provides protection against the specific risk of home currency devaluation eroding the purchasing power of retirement assets in the years immediately before or during retirement, the period when there is the least time to recover from such erosion, and it provides access to international investment opportunities whose returns may be less correlated with the specific economic conditions of the home market, providing diversification across economic environments. The specific proportion appropriate for this pillar varies by individual circumstances, market conditions, and regulatory constraints, but a meaningful allocation, sufficient to provide genuine protection against home currency risk without eliminating participation in the local market's growth opportunities, is worth building deliberately rather than treating as an optional consideration. Pillar 6. The health asset. This pillar is the one most consistently ignored in retirement planning discussions, and it is the one whose absence most frequently destroys retirement plans that are otherwise financially adequate. Healthcare costs in retirement, across virtually all markets, represent one of the largest and most unpredictable expense categories. The combination of Increasing healthcare needs with age and the typically high and rising cost of quality. Healthcare in African markets means that an otherwise well-funded retirement can be rapidly depleted by a significant health event that requires sustained medical attention. Building the health asset means two specific things in the retirement planning context. First, maintaining health insurance coverage throughout the working years and into retirement, not as a grudging expense, but as a specific retirement asset whose value is realized when healthcare needs arise, preventing the liquidation of other retirement assets to meet those needs. Second, making the behavioral investments in physical health during the working years that reduce the probability and severity of health crises. In retirement, the dietary choices, the physical activity habits, the regular health monitoring that are easier and cheaper to maintain proactively than to address reactively after a significant health event has occurred. Dangote's reported attention to physical health and fitness throughout his career is not incidental to his financial success. The capacity to continue building, managing, and directing an industrial empire well into his 7th decade of life depends on a physical foundation that makes continued intellectual and strategic engagement possible. The same principle applies at every scale. The retirement plan that assumes continued good health without investing in building and maintaining that health is a plan with a significant unaddressed vulnerability. Pattern interrupt. Let me address something directly that I know some people watching this are feeling right now. The 6-pillar structure just described sounds like it requires more money than most people have. Multiple investment accounts, property, business systems, foreign currency holdings, health insurance. The aggregate cost feels overwhelming relative to a modest income. Here is the specific reframe. You do not build all 6 pillars simultaneously. You build them sequentially, starting with whichever pillar is most accessible at your current capital level and most critical to your specific situation. For most people, beginning this journey, that means starting with Pillar 1, understanding exactly what the existing pension scheme provides, and Pillar 2, beginning consistent equity contributions, even at modest amounts, as soon as the emergency fund discussed in earlier content is established. The other pillars are built progressively as income grows. As earlier pillars generate returns that can be redirected into new pillars, and as knowledge and capability develop through the experience of managing earlier, simpler pillars. The 6-pillar structure is not a description of where you need to be tomorrow. It is a description of where you need to be by the time you retire. And the path to that destination is built 1 pillar at a time, starting with whatever is most accessible today. Act 4, the retirement timeline here, is the specific sequence for building toward retirement. Security across a typical working life, divided into 4 phases that reflect the changing priorities and opportunities available at different stages. Phase 1, foundation building. Ages 20 to 35. This phase is characterized by the highest potential impact of early action, because compounding has the longest time to operate on contributions made during this phase, and the lowest capital available to act on that potential. The specific priorities during this phase are establishing the savings, discipline, and the debt elimination discussed in earlier content, making the first equity contributions, however modest, beginning to understand the pension scheme and its projected outcome, and acquiring the financial knowledge through the reading habit, discussed previously, that will enable better decisions in subsequent phases. The specific mistake most common during this phase is prioritizing visible consumption, the car, the apartment upgrade, the lifestyle that signals success, over the invisible foundation building that determines retirement security. Every naira that goes into visible consumption during this phase has the highest opportunity cost of any naira spent across the entire working life, because the compounding it forgoes operates across the longest possible remaining period. Phase 2, acceleration, ages 35 to 45. This phase typically coincides with peak income growth, the career decade during which professional skills and experience translate most directly into earning capacity, and during which business ventures initiated in Phase 1 reach meaningful scale if they have been built consistently. The specific priorities during this phase are substantially increasing equity contributions to reflect the higher income available, beginning real estate acquisition if not already initiated, building the business system toward reduced owner dependence, and beginning to build the foreign currency protection layer. The specific mistake most common during this phase is lifestyle. Inflation, the tendency for spending to expand to match or exceed income growth, preventing the accumulation of the additional retirement assets that the higher income makes possible. The pre-allocation discipline discussed in earlier content is the specific tool that addresses this mistake, ensuring that income increases are partially captured for retirement building rather than entirely absorbed into expanded spending. Phase 3. Consolidation, ages 45 to 55. This phase involves a specific shift in retirement portfolio management, from aggressive accumulation to a balance between continued accumulation and beginning to protect what has been accumulated from the risks that become more consequential as the time horizon to retirement shortens. The specific priorities during this phase are reviewing the total accumulated retirement asset against the target, calculated in the retirement math framework, identifying and closing any significant gaps that remain, transitioning the business toward reduced owner dependence more deliberately, ensuring health insurance coverage is comprehensive and sustainable into retirement, and beginning to shift a portion of the equity portfolio toward more stable, income-generating positions that will be appropriate for the distribution phase of retirement. The specific mistake most common during this phase is complacency, the sense that what has been accumulated is sufficient without doing the specific calculation to verify that conclusion. Many people who feel financially comfortable in their early 50s are significantly behind their actual retirement targets when they complete the retirement math framework for the first time. Phase 4. Transition, ages 55 to 60. This phase bridges the gap between the working life and retirement itself, and its specific management determines whether retirement begins from a position of security or from the compromised position that most people across Africa find themselves in when they stop working. The specific priorities during this phase are completing the shift from accumulation to distribution-appropriate positioning in the investment portfolio, ensuring the business transition is complete with capable management in place, confirming that all properties intended as retirement income assets are owned free and clear, or have a clear timeline to that position, reviewing and confirming health insurance arrangements for retirement, and calculating the specific monthly income that will be available from all sources in retirement and comparing it against the specific income need. The specific mistake most common during this phase is delaying the necessary portfolio and business transitions, maintaining an accumulation phase approach when the distribution phase is imminent, and leaving the business transition insufficiently complete when health or circumstances force retirement before the planned date. Act 5. What Dangote's retirement looks like and what it teaches. I want to close with something specific about how Dangote's own financial trajectory, applied across 4 decades of consistent behavior, illustrates every principle in this retirement plan, not at a scale you need to replicate, but in a way that makes the underlying principles visible and applicable at your own scale. Dangote's retirement, whenever he chooses to initiate it, will be funded by productive assets that generate income independently of his continued personal involvement. His cement plants will continue producing whether he is working or resting. His investments will continue generating returns whether he is making active decisions or delegating entirely to capable management. His business systems, built over decades with capable people and documented processes, will continue functioning beyond his active participation. This is not the retirement of a billionaire that is inaccessible to ordinary people. It is the extreme-scale expression of principles that are available at every scale. Build productive assets during your working years. Ensure those assets can generate income without your continued active presence. Protect those assets from the specific risks, inflation, currency instability, health crises, that can erode their value. And do all of this consistently across the entire working life, rather than waiting until retirement feels imminent. The person who starts building these 6 pillars at 25, with modest initial contributions, will reach retirement with a fundamentally different financial position than the person who intends to start at 35 or 40 or whenever circumstances feel more favorable, not because they were smarter or luckier, because they started earlier, stayed consistent, and allowed compounding to do what compounding does across time, turn modest. consistent effort into outcomes that look extraordinary from the outside, but are entirely predictable from the inside. Most Africans will retire poor. You now have the specific plan that determines whether you are among them. The question is not whether you know what to do. You now know exactly what to do. The question is when you start, and the answer, if you are serious about a different outcome, is today. If this plan gave you something concrete to act on, subscribe. New videos every 2 days on the mindset and systems behind Africa's greatest business empire. See you in the next one.